California is an island. Not literally, of course, but geography and history has subjected the state to the same pressures and influences that make actual islands so insular. Towering mountains separate the bulk of the state from its neighbors, but America's largest desert places hundreds of miles of harsh, sparsely populated landscape between it and the more populated states farther east. Conversely, the largest, richest, and most influential cities in California all sit on the coast: San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. This is no coincidence. Granted statehood in 1850, California began its interaction with the rest of the nation by ocean. It did not border any other state. The next nearest was Texas. The interior was considered hostile, dangerous wilderness, but also just fundamentally lacked roads, so steamships would leave from the East Coast, snake through the Caribbean, and drop off passengers in Panama. There, travelers would cross the country by foot and horse and boat to get to Panama City, where they'd wait for another steamship to bring them to California. At best a 30 or 40-day trip, but incredibly, the fastest way to get from one half of America to the other. This disconnect meant California initially operated more like a colony, especially considering that until telegraph lines spanned the country a decade later, this weeks-long trip was also the fastest way to get information from coast to coast. It wasn't until the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 that the state was truly, reliably connected to the rest of the country by land, giving California two foundational decades to define its identity in isolation. This legacy persists. The disconnect exhibits in small ways that stack up into a meaningful sum. For example, most of the rest of the country is linked by a network of oil pipelines, allowing for cheap and efficient transport of the resource from well to refinery to pump. California is different. With those towering mountains and desolate deserts separating it from the east, the economics never worked out to extend a pipeline to the state. Therefore, California largely buys crude oil from foreign countries, imports it on enormous tanker ships, and refines it locally, which, in addition to the state's strict environmental regulations, explains the higher prices typically seen at their pumps. California even has a small degree of disconnect to the rest of the American road network. It's the only state that requires all travelers to pass through any sort of border formality when driving in. It's not immigration per se, rather an agricultural inspection to check for invasive species, but the point is not that these checks themselves significantly separate the state from the rest. More so, the fact that California is able to isolate and protect itself from pests prevalent in the rest of the country with any degree of success demonstrates just how naturally disconnected it is. The only state to have a similarly extensive agricultural inspection system is Hawaii, made up of literal islands. But the reason California can be so isolated is because it's really, absurdly, filthy rich. The state's center, if defined by wealth concentration, is here, Silicon Valley. It'd be easy to assume the area's riches are overstated, but the numbers offer a quick counterpoint. Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Francisco, the three counties that encompass the core of Silicon Valley, have a collective GDP of $725 billion. This is closest to that of Poland, the 21st largest nation in the world, home to 38 million people. The uninitiated might assume that San Francisco and Silicon Valley are more or less one and the same. Sure, San Francisco has a big tech scene, but the major headquarters are distributed across the towns and cities to the south of it. Google is in Mountain View, Apple is in Cupertino, Netflix is in Los Gatos. What this means is that these titans of tech, some of the largest companies in the world, are headquartered in some rather small cities, 82,000, 60,000, and 34,000 residents respectively. Therefore, they're regulated by tiny, hyper-competitive local governments. In fact, San Francisco, the city you know best, is not even the largest city in the San Francisco Bay Area. San Jose has 983,000 residents to San Francisco's 815,000 because the entire area is just subdivided into a huge number of smaller cities and towns, which is a bit of a trend. Los Angeles County, encompassing most, but not even all of the metro area, is composed of 88 different cities plus unincorporated areas. Across both of the state's largest urbanized masses, what functions like one city operates as dozens, even hundreds, leaving few comprehensive, overarching bodies to align incentives. Zoomed in, considering the odd relationship and power dynamics of neighboring communities, or zoomed out, considering the state's historical and contemporary isolation, California's as unique a state there is. Uniqueness has brought benefits, but uniqueness has also created unique problems and bizarre, sometimes convoluted means of solving them. Take homelessness. This is a hot-button, highly visible issue with complicated causes and largely theoretical solutions, so it's easy for conversations over it to spiral out of scale. A quick look at the statistics, however, makes one thing unmistakably clear. California's homelessness problem is uniquely bad. Of the 582,462 people experiencing homelessness nationwide in 2022, 171,521 were in California. That's nearly 30% of the nation's total, or for comparison, some 97,000 more than New York and some 150,000 more than Florida, the states with the second and third largest homeless populations. But California is the most populous state in the nation, so this should be considered at a per-resident rate. And here too, California outpaces the rest, with 44 people experiencing homelessness per 10,000. More troubling still, despite the highest total and the highest rate, the problem's only getting worse. From 2020 to 2022, while 23 states saw decreases in their homeless populations, California's rose by another 6%, 10,000 people. So it's a big, bad, and worsening problem, and while it's at the top of meeting agendas from small city halls all the way to Sacramento, it doesn't look like it'll be fixed anytime soon. While no state has figured out how to solve homelessness, it is generally understood that providing stable shelters and housing programs is associated with lowering numbers. It tracks then that California has comparatively little in the way of shelter beds, as the state has instead opted to prioritize permanent housing projects, which have proved expensive and incredibly slow to build. This has left more and more out in the relative cold. In 2022, 2/3 of California's homeless were considered unsheltered, living out of tents, cars, campers, or on the streets, far from shelters and services that could potentially turn things around. Now, the state government has watched this problem grow and spread and tried to think of solutions while throwing millions upon millions of dollars at it. Yet, the state has the largest, most visible homeless problem in the nation and has little in the way of solutions or even stopgaps in place to alleviate the issue. Much of this is the function of a simple reality that the state government has surprisingly little control over. It's really hard to build in California. The difficulty in finding housing extends to everyone here. The state is in the middle of a housing crisis. But this isn't because of a faltering economy or meager wages. California, year in year out, ranks as one of the highest average income states in the nation, and yet, in one analysis of 2019 numbers, once adjusted for cost of living, it plummets to 48th. Rather than unemployment or low-paying jobs, it's the sky-high cost of living that puts so many so perilously close to losing a home. All it could take is one medical emergency. Bizarrely, the explanation could be that the state's economy is too strong for its own good. Take this simple metric, the jobs-housing ratio, which considers how many jobs are created in relation to how many units of housing are added to a given area. For local employment to remain healthy without adding to congestion, traffic, or displacing longtime residents, the US EPA considers a ratio ranging from 0.75 to 1.5 as healthy for an urban area. In the last decade, popular cities clearly on the rise have begun to push the upper reaches of this range. Phoenix's metro area sits at 1.34, Seattle's 1.43, Austin's 1.47, and Denver's 1.73, but California has blown the roof off this range. The LA Long Beach Anaheim metro topped 2, Riverside San Bernardino Ontario has reached 2.72, and the San Jose Sunnyvale Santa Clara ratio of new jobs per unit of housing hit a truly staggering 3.19. Of course, an unrelenting economy only accounts for the numerator here, the jobs. The denominator is just as responsible for the state's housing crisis, but this is the outcome of a concept a bit more nebulous: the California dream. Of all the floating, intangible assumptions as to what life in California is supposed to look like, the long sunny days and pleasant temperatures, along with a plethora of good jobs, beaches, and open space, it's the single-family home with a lawn and perhaps a pool that's proved the most important, the most concrete, and currently the most controversial. And it's this core tenet that's causing such massive problems. Californians, after all, desperately want to keep what they were sold on, and they're willing to fight for it. Take Atherton, a small Silicon Valley town just minutes away from Stanford. In 2022, to keep up with state mandates on housing requirements, the City Council began the process of rezoning one single-family lot to build an apartment building. The project was quickly axed. It wasn't a lack of money or a lack of municipal will. It was axed because the city's most influential, powerful executives and even basketball player Steph Curry banded together and pressured the city out of it. To them, the project would hurt their property values, cut off their views, change the character of the community, and create more traffic. So the project and its 16 units of desperately needed housing died on the vine and forced city planners back to the drawing board. While the characters might not be as high profile as those in Haerther, this happens all the time, all over the state. Here, the city government decided to designate itself as a mountain lion sanctuary, which was odd, but conveniently allowed it to forego new housing development. Here, in 2019, construction on a 154-bed shelter broke ground only for Venice Beach to sue the city of Los Angeles to halt construction. Here, residents of San Francisco's Embarcadero area did the same, suing the city over establishing a 200-bed shelter in the same neighborhood. And across the larger Bay Area, those who want California to stay the same low-density California of old have created their own organizations, councils, and committees, Better Cupertino and Palo Alto for Sensible Zoning, to name a few. This isn't just a fringe. More and more, anti-density proponents are winning local elections. All of this is, after all, in the local interest. If one small town has enough power to push the problem over to the next, clearly a constituency will opt for that over something that could damage their property values. The state has the money and the interest in solving its problems with homelessness and housing shortages, but can only do so much when powerful local governments resist even the most minor of zoning changes and the smallest of housing projects. So, unexceptional problems have grown to exceptional size, and as the unexceptional solution of simply building more housing gets rejected, the state legislature turns to the spectacular, launching projects to systematically convert motels into housing units, backing anti-NIMBY laws, and filing lawsuits against its own cities. And all of this absurd mess is confined to the issue of housing. There are, of course, fires. There's also too much water in some places and too little in others. There's spats about who deserves Colorado River water at the state level and at the local level. There's traffic, there's aging infrastructure, there's companies leaving the state and middle-class workers following them. There's a lot of bickering and a lot to bicker about. Clearly, problems have accumulated in California to an untenable level, and systematically, they aren't getting solved. Something seems fundamentally wrong with the state, so maybe it needs a fundamental solution. Maybe California should just be a country. It sounds ludicrous, right? Of course California can't become a country. It would never happen. Congress would never allow it. But perhaps the point worth focusing on is how much less ludicrous it sounds when considering the argument. After all, California wouldn't be out of place as a country. It would rank 59th in physical size between Iraq and Paraguay, 38th in population between Canada and Poland, and 5th in GDP between Germany and India, so it would actually be above average on all major metrics of scale. One of the common refrains against secession movements is that breakaway regions could not survive economically on their own. For example, according to the UK government, for every dollar Scotland pays in taxes, it receives about $1.32 back. The country would have an immediate and dramatic budget deficit upon full independence. This fact undergirds some of the strongest hesitancies among Scots themselves on the matter. But California is different. In 2019, before the pandemic skewed the data, the state received just 97 cents back in federal spending for every dollar it sent the federal government. This put the state, each year, in a small camp of around 10 that received less than what they gave, while others, like Mississippi, Kentucky, and West Virginia, consistently received more than $2 back for every dollar they sent. Of course, this is by design. The US's progressive tax system is supposed to take disproportionately from the wealthy and give disproportionately to the less wealthy, but from California's perspective, many wonder why they're sending all their dollars to unappreciative states thousands of miles away. And adding to that, California doesn't even get as much of a say in how those dollars get spent. Given the unequal distribution of electoral votes in presidential elections, every individual in Wyoming has the voting power of about 3.7 Californians, while the Senate system of 2 senators per state, regardless of population, further compounds this weak representation. Again, the system was purposely designed hundreds of years ago to amplify the voices of smaller states, but from California's perspective, they get the short end of that stick. Feeling underrepresented by Washington, California has long legislated less like a state and more like a nation, passing sweeping, powerful laws when it feels like the federal government can't or won't. For example, it's long had a ban on assault rifles, similar to the one that the Biden administration is attempting to pass. It's announced a ban on gas-powered vehicles by 2035, similar to other bans passed by countries. It's established its own immigration law, largely focused on educating detainees on their rights prior to handing them over to what the state might characterize as abusive federal authorities. It's even formed relationships with countries, having signed a joint environmental accord with New Zealand at COP26. In many ways, fixing perceived federal shortcomings has become a central focus of Californian politics, but unsurprisingly, this dynamic has spurred tensions with DC, especially when federal power sways towards the right. There certainly is not the political will for California secession right now, not even close, but if there was one big perceived encroachment on California's rights, a knockdown of their assault rifle ban or a nationwide abortion ban, one could imagine that political will accumulating quickly. But it's still a largely moot point because it would almost certainly be fixing a problem by creating a bigger problem. As much as California might be held back by sending dollars to Washington or sitting subject to its laws, the state is massively buoyed by its inclusion in the largest economy in the world. Removing itself from the US would have dire economic consequences that would surely outweigh any gain. Perhaps the closest equivalent is Brexit. Much of the political will came from a belief that the European Union was taking the country's money and encroaching on its sovereignty, but now, just a few years on, with mounting issues on trade and travel, public opinion has shifted decisively towards regret. Most agree that removing the UK from the world's third largest economy was not the right move. Public opinion on Californian independence has never neared a majority, but there have been enough fringe movements seeking secession that the question has been included in legitimate political polling, reliably demonstrating surprising support for the idea. Between 14 and 32% of respondents were for Californian nationhood. In fact, in one poll run by a Stanford-affiliated think tank, the 18 to 29 demographic responded as 36% for and just 40% against, almost even, demonstrating that, while majority opinion is not nearly in support of the extreme, unprecedented measure of modern state secession, the perceived disconnect with Washington has pushed the idea up to surprising levels of legitimacy. We all know pragmatically that secession will never happen in anything close to this reality, but partition could. The underlying idea is the same, that California is big, underrepresented, overtaxed. The solution is just less extreme. Split it into smaller states. This has been proposed legitimately over 200 times, and the most recent concerted push was led by billionaire investor Tim Draper in 2018. He proposed splitting the state into three parts called Northern California, Southern California, and California, attempting to balance population, wealth, and politics somewhat evenly across the three. The central argument was that the state government was out of touch with local governments given the huge difference in size between the two, and that the federal government was out of touch with the state government given the diluted representation, so the solution was to reduce the size of the state, and also, given the 2 senators per state system, give more powerful federal representation to the population. The argument was persuasive enough to generate far more than 367,000 signatures necessary to put the question on the ballot, but before Election Day, it was struck down by the state Supreme Court on constitutional grounds. Even so, it probably wouldn't have passed. Polling showed its support between 13 and 17%, but even if the state did vote for it, it'd then be up to the federal government to approve such a split, and the federal government would almost certainly never approve a split. Democrats would balk at the fact that it would fracture a strongly Democratic state, Republicans would balk at the 4 additional left-leaning congresspeople it would send to DC, everyone would ask whether it'd be too dangerous a precedent to establish. So the big solutions aren't reasonable, and these small solutions aren't working. Perhaps the answer is that California is just too unique, because it definitely is unique. There is no state, region, or other national subdivision with a larger economy on Earth, and going down the list, there aren't really even near equivalents. Texas is number 2, but it's run by small government conservatives, meaning state intervention on problems is limited. New York is number 3, but nearly all of its GDP is concentrated in one massive metro area, meaning its structure is far simpler. You then have England, but it acts as a nation within a nation, then Guangdong and Jiangsu, but China isn't a democratic state, then Florida, but it has a Texas-style small government bent, then Shandong and Xishan, also China, then Illinois, mostly one city, then Henan, also China, then finally Pennsylvania. With its comparatively conservative, smaller government politics, it's not a great equivalent to California, but it's the closest so far considering its wealth is somewhat geographically distributed and its government is more open to intervention than in Florida or Texas. So that's to say, California is not only unique to the rest of the US, it's unique to the world. Truly nobody is trying to manage such a big economy with anything less than nation status. It has unique problems, it feels disconnected from the nation, it lacks the power of the nation, and yet it feels like it needs to act like a nation. This should sound familiar because in 1776, 13 North American colonies declared independence from Britain, citing their unique problems, feeling of disconnection, lack of nation-scale power, and an inkling that just being a nation was a way to fix it all. What happened next was America. And what happened after that was American exceptionalism. The belief that the US is fundamentally and dramatically unique. This is, in many ways, true. There just aren't places that mirror the US's scale, geography, and demographics, but this feeling undergirds perhaps the most fundamental feature of American politics. A belief that, as a unique place, the US needs unique solutions. There is a systematic rejection of solutions that have repeatedly worked in close cultural equivalents out of a belief that they're incompatible with either what makes America unique or the uniqueness itself. So that means that California is the exception to the exception. The state is exceptional. It is fundamentally different to the rest of the nation, and therefore an analogous idea of Californian exceptionalism permeates through Sacramento, undergirding a belief that they too require unique solutions. After all, California is supposed to be the land of economic opportunity, a destination free of persecution, an idyllic antithesis to the status quo. California is America's America. The exception to the exception is not the norm, it's something more than the exception. California is like the hyper-distilled version of America itself, developing for many of these same reasons as the nation itself, just a century or two on. It's no wonder that the state centered on rejecting norms from the country centered on rejecting norms might stray from the most obvious path. It's also no wonder that, in the same way America itself becomes the infatuation of international media, a source of political entertainment, so too does California to the US. At the end of the day, Californian politicians might just be terrible. The GOP talking points might be right, and the state might be the evidence that liberal politics are structurally flawed, but it's near impossible to sift through the political rhetoric and actually objectively analyze this. However, it's reasonably clear that Californian politicians, like American politicians, have a tougher job to do navigating a truly singular situation. Decisions are made without precedent, and then in retrospect, with precedent established, failures seem obvious. So the question of how to solve California's problems is more so the question of how to solve America's problems. Should it keep trying to find something new, to fight exceptionalism with exceptionalism, or can unexceptional solutions work for unexceptional problems even when they happen in exceptional places? Last year, in a video about carbon offsets, we covered California's unique cap-and-trade program, which was supposed to be an elegant way to curb industrial emissions, but in practice propped up ineffective carbon offsets and illogical forest management practices. This is a classic story in the carbon offsetting world. It's a concept that works in theory, but regularly fails in practice. That's because carbon offsets are really only as good as the entity managing them. That's why I'm so excited to have REN as a sponsor. I didn't trust REN at first. Nobody should really trust any carbon offsetting provider at first, as the industry is ripe with scams. But because they were interested in sponsoring and were insistent they had found solutions to the problems I highlighted in my video, I got on a call with them and they walked me through their process. I left impressed. I did my absolute best grilling them, but they had thoughtful answers for how they vet their projects and ensure efficacy. For example, even the most highly vetted carbon offsetting projects can go wrong when put into practice, so they counter this by never selling offsets linked to a single project, only for their portfolio of projects designed to balance things out so that if one project falls through, the others are there to pull the average up. This also means they can use some of the money to fund more experimental processes, like mineral weathering, hoping that it can develop into a lower cost offsetting method in the future. I really get the sense that REN is the real deal. It's run by a small team of dedicated people passionate about providing an easy way for people to rectify their personal emissions, so that's why I decided to promote them over every other carbon offsetting provider that asked. I use Ren for both my personal and business offsetting because I can trust them to do everything possible to make sure my money actually leads to carbon offset. So if you want to do the same, click the button on screen or the link in the description, and the first 100 to do so will get their first month of the subscription covered by Ren for free.